Have you ever watched a live TV interview and thought, something is off? No edits, no second takes, just a camera, a spotlight, and a star slowly drifting out of sync with the moment. During the late golden age of Hollywood and in the years that followed, live television occasionally caught icons at their most unguarded. Slurred words, wandering focus, awkward pauses no script could fix. Today we're counting down 10 times. Golden age stars were visibly out of it on live TV moments the cameras never meant to preserve, but did anyway. Number 10. Tallulah Bankhead. Live television in the early 1950s was supposed to be polite, carefully rehearsed, respectable. Tallulah Bankhead never got that memo. By the time she began appearing regularly on live TV talk shows and variety programs, Bankhead was already a legend not just for her stage and film work, but for her unapologetic appetite for excess. Audiences tuning in expected wit and scandal. What they didn't expect was how visibly unfiltered she could be once the cameras were rolling. During several live appearances, Bankhead slurred her words, lost her train of thought mid-sentence, and drifted into long, meandering monologues that bore little resemblance to the questions she'd been asked. Interviewers often attempted polite course corrections, only to be steamrolled by laughter, innuendo, and sudden topic shifts that felt spontaneous to the point of chaos. What stood out most wasn't just her speech, it was her physical presence. Bankhead lounged instead of sitting. She leaned too close. She laughed at moments that didn't land with the audience. On more than one occasion, her eyes appeared unfocused, her reactions delayed, as if she were a beat behind everyone else in the room. Viewers at home noticed, critics noticed, and yet no one stopped her. That's the key difference between Golden Age television and what came later. Bankhead's behavior was treated less like a problem and more like a feature. Hosts nervously smiled through it. Producers let segments run long. The audience laughed, unsure whether they were witnessing a performance or something far less controlled. Bankhead herself never clarified. She didn't deny anything. She didn't explain. That ambiguity only added to the spectacle. Was this Tallulah being Tallulah, or was something else happening entirely? Live TV thrives on unpredictability, and Bankhead delivered it in abundance. What made her appearances unforgettable wasn't scandal, it was the sense that the broadcast could go anywhere at any moment. In an era built on restraint, she was a walking violation. Whether viewers interpreted her behavior as intoxication, exhaustion, or pure theatrical abandon, one thing was undeniable. Tallulah Bankhead on live television never felt fully tethered to the room, and that made every appearance feel dangerous in the most entertaining way possible. Number 9. Errol Flynn. By the time Errol Flynn appeared on live television later in life, the image that once defined him had already begun to unravel. Gone was the athletic swashbuckler who dominated adventure films. In his place stood a man who seemed permanently distracted, drifting through interviews as though he'd wandered onto the set by accident. Live TV only magnified the effect. During multiple unscripted broadcasts, Flynn appeared sluggish, glassy-eyed, and oddly detached from the conversation unfolding around him. He answered questions slowly when he answered them at all. Sometimes he stared off camera. Other times he laughed at remarks that hadn't been made. Hosts struggled to maintain structure. Flynn interrupted questions with unrelated anecdotes. He forgot names. He contradicted himself mid-story. The rhythm of live television depends on timing, and Flynn's timing was consistently off. What made these appearances uncomfortable wasn't any single moment, it was the accumulation. A pause that lasted too long. A sentence that never found its ending. A smile that lingered just a bit too wide, as if disconnected from the room. Audiences at home noticed the difference immediately. This wasn't the sharp, charismatic Flynn of old clips. This was someone else entirely looser, slower, less anchored. The live format removed the safety net of editing, leaving viewers to draw their own conclusions. Producers didn't comment. Networks didn't intervene. This was still an era where a star's mystique was protected, even when the cracks were visible in real time. Flynn himself leaned into charm, but charm can only cover so much when the broadcast is happening live. His stories wandered. His focus evaporated. And as the interview dragged on, The host's polite laughter began to sound more like relief than amusement. There was no scandal afterward, no headlines, just quiet discomfort and a growing sense that the man on screen wasn't fully present. Live television has a way of revealing what scripted appearances can hide. Or in Flynn's case, it revealed a man adrift, unmoored from the persona that wants to find him, and visibly out of sync with the moment unfolding in front of millions. Number 8. Judy Garland. Live television has a way of stripping away illusion, and few Golden Age stars experience that more visibly than Judy Garland. When Garland appeared on live TV during the late 1950s and into the 1960s, audiences didn't just tune in for nostalgia, they tuned in because anything could happen. And sometimes it did. Without the protection of editing or multiple takes, Garland's on-air presence often felt unpredictable, emotionally charged, and slightly unmoored from the rhythm of the broadcast. Viewers noticed it almost immediately. Her speech would rush forward, then suddenly slow as if she were searching for the end of a sentence. Answers to simple questions stretched into winding, deeply personal reflections. At times she laughed too hard. At other moments she went quiet, staring past the host as though something else had caught her attention off camera. Physically, Garland rarely appeared still. She shifted in her chair. She adjusted her hands. She leaned forward, then back again. Her eyes darted, sometimes bright and engaged, sometimes distant. On live television, those small movements felt amplified. The camera lingered, and there was nowhere for the energy to go. Musically, she was still extraordinary. When Garland sang, the focus snapped back into place. Her voice grounded the room. Applause followed. But the contrast between performance and conversation made everything else more noticeable. Once the song ended, the uncertainty returned. The hosts handled these moments carefully. Questions softened. Interruptions were avoided. Laughter became a form of cover, a way to keep things moving when the pacing slipped. No one acknowledged what viewers at home were already sensing. Critics struggled to put it into words at the time. Reviews leaned on phrases like fragile, overwhelmed, or emotionally raw. But audiences were more direct. Many simply said she looked out of it. What made Garland's live appearances so compelling and so uncomfortable was how exposed they felt. This wasn't a scandal playing out. There were no outrageous antics, just a star who seemed slightly out of sync with the moment she was standing in. Live TV didn't accuse Judy Garland of anything. It didn't editorialize, it didn't explain. It just kept rolling. And in doing so, it captured a series of moments where one of Hollywood's most beloved figures appeared unsteady, unfiltered, and impossible to look away from. Those broadcasts remain unforgettable, not because of what was said, but because of what couldn't be hidden. Number 7. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was no stranger to live television. By the time TV became a national ritual, he was already an institution, an icon whose confidence, timing, and control had been refined over decades, which is exactly why his more unsettled live appearances stood out so sharply. During several late-career live broadcasts in the 1950s and 1960s, viewers noticed something unusual. Sinatra, normally precise and commanding, appeared distracted. His speech occasionally wandered. Jokes landed late or not at all. He repeated himself. Sometimes he seemed locked into his own rhythm while the rest of the show moved ahead without him. On certain appearances, his posture sagged. He leaned heavily on furniture. His eyes looked heavy, unfocused, as if he were scanning the studio rather than engaging with the host. When questions were asked, he sometimes answered something adjacent close, but not quite connected. What made these moments uncomfortable was how uncharacteristic they were. Sinatra built his reputation on control. Even chaos was usually choreographed. But live TV removed that buffer. There was no orchestra to hide behind, no cutaway, no retake. At times, his timing slipped during musical numbers. He came in early. He came in late. He laughed in places that didn't match the room. The band adjusted. The host smiled. The show pushed forward. Audiences noticed. Reviews didn't accuse, but they hinted. Words like off night, loose, and unfocused appeared more than once. Fans debated whether Sinatra was tired, distracted, or simply indifferent to the format. Live television, after all, wasn't his preferred stage. There were moments when Sinatra bristled on air, snapping lightly at hosts, brushing off questions, redirecting attention back to himself with sharp humor that felt more defensive than playful. The confidence was still there, but it came with an edge that made the room feel tense. What's important is what didn't happen. No one confronted him. No one acknowledged the disconnect. The broadcast simply flowed around him, letting the audience interpret what they were seeing. That ambiguity is what makes these appearances linger. Sinatra wasn't melting down. He wasn't performing outrageous stunts. He just didn't seem fully present, like someone operating on a slightly different wavelength than everyone else in the studio. Live television is unforgiving in that way. It doesn't exaggerate. It doesn't explain. It just shows you who's in the room right now. And in those moments, Frank Sinatra, usually the most controlled man on the stage, looked briefly, visibly out of sync with the spotlight he'd mastered for so long. Number 6. Mickey Rooney. By the time Mickey Rooney became a frequent guest on live television later in life, audiences already knew what to expect, or at least they thought they did. Fast talking, high energy, endless stories. What they didn't expect was how often that energy seemed to tip into something harder to follow once the cameras were rolling live. Rooney appeared on numerous unscripted talk shows and variety programs, and while his enthusiasm never dipped, his focus often did. Answers arrived before questions finished. Stories doubled back on themselves. Punchlines appeared without setups. Live TV thrives on rhythm, and Rooney routinely ran ahead of it. Viewers watching at home noticed the pattern. Rooney bounced in his chair. He leaned forward aggressively, then suddenly pulled back. His eyes darted around the studio, sometimes locking onto the host, sometimes drifting toward the audience or off-camera crew. He laughed loudly at his own remarks, occasionally interrupting himself to start another anecdote entirely. What made these moments stand out wasn't chaos, it was disconnection. Rooney seemed to be performing for a room only he could see. Hosts attempted gentle steering, but Rooney often ignored cues, talking over laughter or applause, missing signals that a segment was wrapping. At times, his speech accelerated noticeably. Words tumbled out in rapid bursts, followed by abrupt pauses where he appeared to lose his place. When asked direct questions about his career, Rooney often veered into unrelated memories, some vivid, others fragmented, as though triggered by something unseen. The live format made it impossible to smooth over these moments. There were no edits to tighten pacing, no cutaways to reset energy. The audience saw everything unfold in real time. Critics were careful in their wording. Reviews mentioned restless charm or uncontainable personality, but viewers were more blunt. Many felt Rooney looked wired, distracted, or simply not fully anchored in the conversation happening around him. Despite this, the shows rolled on. Laughter filled the gaps. Hosts smiled and nodded, letting Rooney run until the clock forced a transition. No one addressed the imbalance directly. What made Rooney's live appearances memorable wasn't embarrassment, it was unpredictability. There was a constant sense that the interview could derail at any second, not because of provocation, but because Rooney seemed to be operating on a different internal tempo. Live television doesn't exaggerate energy, it reveals it. And in Rooney's case, it revealed a performer whose momentum no longer matched the structure surrounding him. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't confrontational. He was simply elsewhere, carried by a current only he seemed to feel. And once the broadcast ended, with that lingering sense of disconnection stayed with the audience far longer than any of the stories he told. Number 5. Mae West. By the time Mae West began appearing on live television in her later years, the public already knew the legend, the voice, the timing, the innuendo sharpened to a blade. What they didn't expect was how detached those appearances could feel once the cameras started rolling in real time. West had always performed at her own pace, but live TV exposed just how far that pace drifted from everyone else's. During multiple unscripted broadcasts and variety appearances, West frequently appeared unfocused and oddly disconnected from the conversation happening around her. She delivered lines slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, stretching pauses far beyond what live television could comfortably absorb. Hosts waited. And audiences waited. The silence lingered. When questions were asked, West often responded with something adjacent, or not at all. She'd repeat familiar catchphrases regardless of context. She stared straight ahead, eyes heavy-lidded, reacting a beat late to laughter or applause. At times, it felt less like conversation and more like a monologue drifting through the room. Physically, she remained still, almost statuesque, but that stillness only heightened the sense that she wasn't fully engaged with the moment. Her posture barely changed. Her expression shifted slowly. When she laughed, it arrived delayed, as if catching up to something that had already passed. Live television thrives on exchange. West rarely exchanged. She presented. Hosts tried everything. They leaned in. They laughed louder. They fed her familiar setups, so hoping to spark the old rhythm. Sometimes it worked for a moment, then the pacing slipped again. The show moved forward, but West seemed anchored somewhere else entirely. Viewers noticed. Reviews danced around it, describing her appearances as dreamlike or deliberate. But audience reaction was more blunt. Many felt she seemed out of sync, as though she were operating on a different frequency than the rest of the studio. What made these appearances uncomfortable wasn't scandal or chaos. It was inertia. Nothing exploded. Nothing derailed. The energy simply drifted. Live TV offers no protection against that kind of disconnect. There's no editing to tighten a pause, no music cue to redirect attention. Every second stretches exactly as long as it feels. West never acknowledged it. She didn't explain. She didn't adjust. And perhaps that was the point. Mae West had always existed on her own terms. Live television simply revealed what happened when those terms no longer matched the medium. The broadcasts ended politely. Applause filled the gaps. The camera cut away. But viewers were left with a lingering impression, a Hollywood icon physically present, visually commanding, and yet strangely removed from the moment unfolding in front of her. Number 4. Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre was never a conventional presence on screen, and live television only magnified that strangeness. By the time Lorre began appearing on live TV talk shows and panel programs in the late 1950s and early 1960s, audiences were already accustomed to his nervous energy and off-kilter delivery. What they weren't prepared for was how unsettled he could seem once there were no cuts, or no scripts and no second chances. During several live appearances, Lorre appeared visibly distracted and unfocused. His speech came in uneven bursts, soft and hesitant one moment, rushed and overlapping the next. He frequently interrupted hosts, not out of rudeness, but as if he were afraid the thought would vanish if he didn't say it immediately. There were long pauses where Lorre seemed to lose track of the conversation entirely. He stared down at his hands. He glanced nervously off camera. Sometimes he smiled at moments that didn't match the tone of the room, creating a low-level discomfort that live TV does nothing to soften. Physically, Lorre looked restless. He shifted constantly in his chair. His hands fidgeted. His posture collapsed forward, then snapped upright again without warning. When questions were asked, he often began answering before the host finished speaking, only to trail off halfway through his response. The result was an interview rhythm that never quite settled. Hosts attempted gentle steering, but Lorre rarely followed their lead. Stories veered into tangents. Punchlines arrived without context. The audience laughed uncertainly, unsure whether they were supposed to be amused or simply patient. Viewers at home noticed the imbalance. This wasn't the controlled eccentricity of a film performance. This was something rawer and less contained. The live format stripped away the polish and left behind a man who seemed slightly overwhelmed by the very act of being present. Critics at the time avoided speculation. Instead, they leaned on descriptors like anxious, erratic, or intense. But the common takeaway was simpler. Lorre looked out of it. What made these appearances memorable wasn't spectacle. There were no shocking statements, no overt disruption, just a growing sense that Lorre was operating under a different internal pressure than everyone else in the studio. Live television exposes timing like nothing else. In Peter Lorre's case, it exposed a disconnect between thought and moment one that made his appearances fascinating, uncomfortable, and impossible to fully look away from. The camera never blinked, and neither did the audience. Number 3, Bette Davis. Bette Davis built her reputation on control. Sharp delivery, precise timing, absolute command of a room, which is why her more disoriented live television appearances later in life felt so jarring to audiences who knew exactly how formidable she could be. When Davis appeared on live talk shows and televised interviews in the 1960s and beyond, viewers occasionally witnessed something unexpected. The words were still sharp, but the pacing wasn't. Answers arrived slowly, sometimes after a pause long enough to make hosts glance nervously toward the camera. Other times, responses came too fast, tumbling over themselves before finding a point. There were moments when Davis seemed to drift mid-thought. She'd begin a story with confidence, only to stop abruptly, eyes narrowing as if searching for the rest of it. Hosts waited. The audience waited. The silence stretched in a way live television never forgives. Physically, Davis appeared rigid, narrower then suddenly restless. She adjusted in her seat. She leaned forward sharply, then reclined again as if recalibrating. Her eyes sometimes looked unfocused, scanning the room rather than engaging directly with the person speaking to her. What made these appearances uncomfortable wasn't disrespect or attitude. Davis was famously blunt, and audiences expected that. It was the sense that she wasn't entirely locked into the moment. The sharp wit was there, but it felt delayed, like it was fighting its way through something else. Hosts handled her carefully. Questions softened. Interruptions were avoided. When Davis went off on tangents, sometimes biting, sometimes oddly reflective, the shows let her run, even when the pacing slipped beyond recovery. Viewers noticed. Reviews described her as unfiltered or raw, but audience reaction often leaned toward confusion. This wasn't the firebrand they remembered from classic films. This was someone operating at a different speed than the broadcast around her. Live TV offers nowhere to hide timing issues. A pause is just a pause. A stumble is just a stumble. And Davis, a master of precision, suddenly seemed slightly out of sync with the format. There were no scandals attached to these moments, no headlines, just a lingering unease that something wasn't quite lining up. Bette Davis didn't unravel on live television. She didn't embarrass herself. She simply appeared elsewhere, a fraction removed from the room she was commanding. And in an era when her power came from absolute control, that subtle loss of alignment was impossible not to notice. Number 2. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was never built for live television. Even at his most polished, his presence carried a quiet tension, introspective, inward, carefully controlled. And when that control slipped on live TV later in his career, the effect was impossible to ignore. During several televised interviews and live appearances in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Clift appeared visibly detached from the flow of conversation around him. His speech slowed noticeably. Words came out soft, sometimes barely above a murmur. Answers often trailed off before reaching a conclusion, leaving hosts unsure whether to follow up or move on. There were long pauses, too long for live TV. Clift stared downward. He avoided eye contact. At times, he seemed to forget the question entirely. He responding with something only loosely connected to what had been asked. When laughter came from the audience, it sometimes arrived without acknowledgement, as if he hadn't registered it. Physically, Clift looked uncomfortable in the spotlight. He shifted constantly. His shoulders slumped. His hands fidgeted in his lap. He leaned forward, then back again, like someone trying to find the right distance from the moment and failing. What made these appearances unsettling wasn't chaos, it was fragility. Clift didn't interrupt. He didn't dominate. He simply seemed absent, like someone half present in a room that demanded full engagement. Hosts reacted cautiously. Questions became gentler. The pacing slowed to accommodate him. Occasionally, a co-guest would fill the silence, sensing the discomfort spreading across the studio. In the live format offered no relief. Every second stretched. Viewers noticed immediately. This wasn't the magnetic, emotionally controlled actor from his classic films. This was someone struggling to remain anchored in real time. Critics used careful language, withdrawn, subdued, haunted, but audiences watching at home often reached a simpler conclusion. He looked out of it. Live television didn't expose a scandal. It exposed vulnerability. There was no spectacle, no meltdown, just a visible disconnect between Clift and the broadcast unfolding around him. That disconnect lingered long after the show ended, because unlike film, Live TV doesn't soften edges. It doesn't contextualize. It just shows you what's there. And in Montgomery Clift's case, it showed a brilliant actor whose inner world seemed far louder than the studio around him, leaving audiences watching a man physically present, but emotionally somewhere else entirely. Number 1. Marlon Brando. If live television is a test of presence, Marlon Brando often treated it like a challenge he had no interest in passing. By the time Brando appeared on live TV interviews and talk shows later in his life, his relationship with the medium was openly antagonistic. He disliked questions, he distrusted hosts, and he seemed almost determined to disrupt the natural rhythm of a live broadcast. What made these appearances unforgettable, however, was how visibly unanchored he often appeared once the cameras were rolling. Brando regularly answered questions with long pauses, or staring silently at hosts as if deciding whether the question deserved a response at all. Sometimes he answered with something unrelated. Sometimes he whispered. Other times he spoke slowly, deliberately, as though words were moving through molasses before reaching the microphone. His focus drifted constantly. He looked around the studio. He examined the set. He stared past the camera. When laughter broke out, he often didn't react or reacted late, smiling seconds after the moment had passed. Physically, Brando appeared restless and disengaged at the same time. He slouched. He shifted in his chair. He leaned forward abruptly, then reclined as if retreating from the exchange altogether. His eyes often looked heavy, unfocused, as though he were operating on a different internal clock than everyone else in the room. Hosts struggled. They tried humor. They tried flattery. They tried steering the conversation back to familiar territory. Brando resisted all of it. The live format magnified every awkward pause, every unanswered question, every stretch of dead air. Audiences watching at home were divided. Some saw deliberate rebellion, others saw distraction. But many came away with the same impression. Brando didn't seem fully present, not confrontational, not explosive, just detached. Critics avoided labeling it outright, but phrases like dazed, checked out, and disengaged appeared repeatedly in reviews of his televised appearances. Unlike scripted performances, there was no character to hide behind. This was Brando, unfiltered. What made these moments linger wasn't scandal, it was discomfort. Live TV depends on mutual participation, and Brando refused to give it. The result was a series of broadcasts that felt unsteady, unpredictable, and quietly unsettling. Live television doesn't lie, it just keeps rolling. And when it rolled on Marlon Brando, it captured a star who seemed physically in the room, but mentally somewhere else entirely. That disconnect, more than any single comment or moment, is why Marlon Brando stands as the most visibly out-of-sync golden age star ever caught on live television. Live television doesn't offer second chances. No edits, no damage control. Just a camera capturing whatever happens in the moment. For golden age stars raised on scripts, studio protection, and careful image control, that made live TV uniquely unforgiving. Sometimes it revealed charm, sometimes vulnerability, and sometimes it caught icons slightly out of sync with the world around them. These weren't scandals or confessions, just unguarded moments preserved forever. And decades later, they still remind us that even Hollywood legends couldn't always stay in control once the red light came on.